Welcome back to the video companion series for the African Methodist Episcopal Church, A History, written by Dr. Dennis C. Dickerson Sr. My name is Dennis C. Dickerson Jr., and I'll be summarizing Chapter 5, Into the Second Century, Migration, Depression, and War, 1916 to 1945. In Section 1, Reckoning with World War I, the Church entered its centennial year and held its general conference where it all started, Mother Bethel in Philadelphia. At this point, the AME Church had over 500,000 members in more than 6,000 churches in almost every state. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, racism morphed into advanced systems of segregation and colonialism on both sides of the Atlantic. AMEs adopted strategies to resist and overcome hegemonic structures. Though equipped with an impressive infrastructure of denominational departments, AMEs adhered to an erroneous belief that organizational achievements immunized them from imminent global and societal changes. Responses to wars, demographic movements, black nationalism, and economic crises were at times belated, inadequate, and too reliant on routine rhetoric. AMEs maintained an ambivalent posture toward war. They embraced the Civil War and Spanish-American War, and boasted of Wilberforce's United States Military Department, and of their prestigious roster of chaplains, such as George A. Singleton and J. Acton Hill. AME agencies appropriated special funds for chaplains and endorsed ministers and members who entered the military. Denominational leaders were historically invested in the military and therefore did not develop anti-war views. The Church, however, was critical of Army segregation and other racist practices. AMEs were proud of the 380,000 Negro soldiers. Denominational leaders issued no verdict on the morality of war, unlike other Christians who opposed violence of any kind. Reverend C. Ransom, editor of the AME Church Review, was among the first black intellectuals to recognize Gandhi's nonviolence in India as a moral principle and praxis grounded in spirituality. Section 2, African Methodism and the Black Migration, shifts to the black migration from the rural South to the urban and industrial North, and the violent response of white workers, which drew an increased share of the Church's attention. Various presiding elders during the period observed that job prospects for their members would determine whether their congregations would flourish or decline. When strikes, recessions, and racial exclusion from organized labor occurred, they lamented these developments and their negative impact on the AME churches. AMEs recognized that World War I thrust African Americans toward a new threshold of economic opportunity. AMEs pledged to aid blacks in the resettlement in the North and to provide material services for migrating Southerners. Richard R. Wright, Jr. believed blacks would get a better education in the North, become voters, and earn higher wages and join labor organizations. The effects were such that churches in the North inevitably grew, but Georgia, for example, lost some of its best members to the migration. Sadie Tanner Moselle, granddaughter of Bishop Tanner, examined whether the wages that migrants earned were sufficient to sustain them in the North, and concluded that because of family size, unwise spending habits, and racial discrimination, that churches needed to help. Charles H. Wesley also talked to migrants and did not find them to be unthrifty, but instead saw they brought their life savings, sold property, and bought homes to settle in the North. Churches such as Bethel in Pittsburgh had elite light-skinned members proud of their class and color, and endorsed Bethel's practice of seating light-skinned and dark-skinned members. Mother Bethel in Philadelphia's Old Settler faction was unsympathetic to any vigorous outreach to newcomers. Some churches were late to realize they could not ignore the irreversible forces that migration unleashed. The Ohio Annual Conference resolved to avoid such expressions as Southern Negroes and Northern Negroes. In the wake of the closing of mines and mills, strikes, and unemployment, Black Southerners often moved from Pittsburgh to Cleveland, Chicago, Detroit, or Philadelphia, places that maintained full employment. This exodus brought new AME members and replenished ministerial ranks with transplanted Southern preachers. Both employers and clergy developed social service initiatives aimed at providing needed amenities to Black newcomers. Employers directly deployed congregations and their pastors to fulfill functions that Black welfare officers performed for steel managers in Western Pennsylvania. Bethel AME in Detroit started a social service department and helped over 300 people find jobs. Park Place AME near Pittsburgh organized a real estate agency to find residences for sale or rental to Blacks on low monthly installments. White and immigrant industrial workers, accustomed to a small minority of Black laborers in the mass production industries, jealously guarded their ascendancy in northern mills, mines, and factories. AME leaders condemned white on Black violence. AMEs in North Ohio, for example, noticed the influence of Southern whites in the North and feared the North was just as unsafe as the South. In several industries, including in iron and steel, Black workers became strikebreakers against racially exclusionary unions. A consensus was developing in African Methodism against Black workers filling the role of strikebreaker and preferred that they should belong to unions. AME prelates understood the better the working condition of the Negro, the higher the wages, which would better prepare him to contribute more liberally to the financial enterprises of the church. The AME church lost ground in the shifting religious landscape among African Americans. In all the major northern cities to which Southern migrants came, they encountered AME congregations of proud longevity and varying degrees of class and color pretensions. AMEs were known to eschew popular music and favored a prescribed order of service, where a majority of Baptist churches and all of the Holiness, Pentecostal, and Spiritualist churches engaged in spiritual spontaneity, personal testimonies, glossolalia, shouting, and exuberant responses to loud and emotional preaching. In addition, AMEs were slow to embrace new technologies such as records and radio broadcasts. In Section 3, African Methodism and Garveyism, the author explains the ways in which Garveyism aimed at the redemption of Africa and mobilizing Black opposition to colonial and racial subjugation, while also mimicking AME activity in the Atlantic world. The same Pan-Africanist energies and social holiness objectives that defined African Methodism were harnessed to Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association. Garvey developed a rhetoric that resonated with AMEs and tapped into their rich heritage of Black autonomy. Garvey's Black Star Line, his newspaper, The Negro World, the Parallel African Orthodox Church, and his focus on the rehabilitation of Africa reflected historic perspectives and practices of the AME Church. Richard Tobit embodied a blended Atlantic AME and Garveyite identity. His career as an educator and AME minister started in Bermuda. He noticed the lack of educational facilities on the island. Tobit was a UNIA ambassador and found it difficult to strike a balance between his AME and UNIA loyalties. The AME Church was a pioneer for education in Bermuda. Without African Methodism, Black education on the island would have been seriously restricted. A Pan-African religious body discusses how John A. Gregg embodied the AME transatlantic identity. He was elected a bishop and assigned to South Africa, where he founded an AME school in the Cape Province. Gregg participated in a subtle insurgency against white-controlled evangelization in Africa and served on the Committee on the American Negro and Africa, which said that African Americans should be permitted by governments and encouraged by missionary societies to play an increasingly important part in African evangelization. The ongoing Pan-Africanism of AMEs lay behind their presence in Cuba starting in 1898. John H. DeVoe appealed to the 1938 summer session of the Council of Bishops to visit Cuba. The AME Commission to Cuba, endorsed by Colonel Fulgencio Batista, sparked genuine interest among Cubans. In Section 5, the Great Depression, bishops and general officers saw a reduction in their salaries. Some AME responses included Allen Chapel in Kansas City, Missouri, which operated a food kitchen and provided cots and showers for the homeless, and Bethel in Baltimore, which opened up a soup kitchen. Some AMEs were loyal to Republicans, but Democrat Franklin D. Roosevelt defeated Republican President Herbert Hoover in 1932 due to unemployment and other hardships of the Depression. J.G. Robinson, the review editor, was skeptical of FDR and Democrats because the party had been historically hostile to blacks. Many AMEs were partial to Republicans because the denominational schools Wilberforce and Western University housed normal and industrial departments funded by Republican-run state governments. Blacks eventually shifted Democratic, and some AMEs became Democratic office holders. Few AMEs believed the same racial discrimination that permeated American society left New Deal programs unaffected. AMEs joined with other African Americans in criticizing the New Deal initiatives. John P. Davis and Robert C. Weaver organized the Joint Committee on National Recovery, which proposed to monitor National Industrial Relief Act codes to ensure the full integration of blacks. Sadie Tanner Moselle Alexander criticized the Economic Security Act. AMEs lamented the negative impact of FDR's farm program. And the Chicago Annual Conference showed disappointment about the racial inequities pervasive in the various New Deal programs. In Section 6, World War II, the AME Church, neither its leaders nor its rank-and-file members, with some exceptions, were pacifists. In the same month the Nazis marched into Paris, Bishop Gregg, in the 1940 Episcopal Address, explained why the specter of the isms imperiled world peace and compelled AME support for the Allies. AMEs opposed the communism of Russia, fascism in Italy, Nazism in Germany, and discrimination and prejudice in the United States. There were approximately 125,000 blacks fighting in World War II. The Fraternal Council of Negro Churches, founded by Reverend C. Ransom in 1934, requested that a representative from the council be sent to Pacific and European, North African, and Near Eastern war fronts to visit and encourage the morale of African American troops. Military chaplains became of such ecclesiastical importance that it led to their membership into the General Conference. AME bishops offered their services to Roosevelt in whatever capacity and supported federal defense initiatives. Roosevelt appointed Bishop Ransom to the Volunteer Participation Committee in the Office of Civilian Defense. Federal officials regularly appeared at denominational meetings to cement their alliance with AMEs and win over or neutralize Republicans. Mary McLeod Bethune, Director of Negro Affairs in the National Youth Administration, dispersed funds to construct buildings on Wilberforce's campus. The visit of Eleanor Roosevelt to the 1944 General Conference climaxed for AMEs the desire of the Roosevelt administration to retain black support for its New Deal and national defense policies. In the final section, Internal Strains, bishops only gave periodic attention to issues pertaining to black advancement and grew increasingly preoccupied with the powers and prerogatives of their episcopal office. Ira T. Bryant, Secretary-Treasurer of the Sunday School Union, was critical of the bishop's integrity and challenged what he viewed as unchecked authority. Charles Leander Hill believed their misconduct drew from a fundamental misunderstanding of the episcopacy within a Protestant tradition. The Connectional Lay College agitated for a greater role in denominational governance. At the 1928 General Conference, they gained equal representation as General Conference delegates. Also in this time, the Judicial Council was recommended at the 1946 special session of the General Conference. Thank you so much for joining us. Now please stay tuned as Dr. Christina Dickerson-Cousin interviews another dynamic panel of AME scholars, clergy, and lay. Please submit your questions and comments via Facebook Live. Thank you again.